My name is Molly R. Stern Schlussel. If you heard what I heard, you would never forget.
If you heard what I heard, this podcast shares the powerful stories of Holocaust survivors, told by their grandchildren, the last generation to ever hear Holocaust survivor stories firsthand. So join me as we listen, learn, and remember. Together, we can make sure the world will never forget so that it never happens again.
I am the granddaughter of two Holocaust survivors, Frank Stern and Magda Stern. Today, I'm going to share the story of my grandparents' survival. My grandfather, Frank, was born in part of Yugoslavia but was still considered Hungary at that time, and then moved to Budapest in his 20s. My grandmother, Magda, grew up in Budapest. She met Frank when he was 27 years old. She was 21 years old. He worked in the menswear department at a department store. And Magda, my grandmother, was a seamstress. They were married around 1938 in Budapest. They were middle class. They went to the opera. They went out to dinner. They lived a very regular life before the war. Because Hungary was an ally with Germany, the Hungarians had control over what they did with their Jews, their Jewish citizens, whereas most of Europe was immediately shipping them off to different concentration camps. In Hungary, they didn't do that right away. They created the Jewish ghetto, and then slowly but surely they took the Jews' rights away. So, it started with like my grandfather lost his job, my grandmother lost her job. Then their property was taken away. Then they were put into the Jewish ghetto. Then they were told that they had to wear armbands that signified that they themselves were Jewish. Then, as the war carried on and grew on, Hungary created the labor service, where they drafted all the Jewish men to be a part of this. And so they were using the labor service as like if they had to go into any sort of war zone, if the Hungarians had to go into any war zone, they would send the Jews in first. Or if they thought something was bombed, was laced with bombs, they would send the Jews in first. So my grandfather was drafted to be part of the Hungarian labor service. My grandmother was living in the ghetto with her sister, who was called Bubby, and her sister's daughter, Elise. And her father, I believe, her mother died when she was younger. And they lived in the ghetto. And some of the stories that I had heard is that Bubby, my grandmother's sister, sort of did whatever she could to help her family survive. A lot of using her body and her sexuality to barter for food. Somewhere between 1941 and 1943, Frank, my grandfather, went to Russia to work in the labor service. And he would often try to sneak away from his troop to get food because, they weren't treated very well. However, when the Hungarian soldiers took leave to go home, they took their labor service men with them, which was how my grandfather was able to go and see my grandmother back in the ghetto. And that's when he and my grandmother conceived my father, who was born September 6th, 1944, born in the ghetto. When they went to Russia, basically the Hungarians and the Germans were able to progress only so far, because once winter hit, all of their tanks and artillery froze. And this is where a lot of my grandfather's crazy, miraculous story of survival took place, in the sense that he was able to get away at different times and try to find little villages where he could steal food or find things that he could save to bring back to my grandmother, who was living in the ghetto in Budapest. One story that really stood out to me is one time they were all marching down towards some river where they were going to be killed, and it was pitch black, and my grandfather bent down to tie his shoe, and the whole troop moved onward, not seeing that he had stopped. So he took that opportunity to go run into the hills and see what he could find, and he found a farmhouse and he stole a bar of soap. And at that time, soap was made from pig fat. And so he would chip off little bites of that soap. It like sustained him for many, many months because he would live off this little bar of soap because they were so malnourished, and so underfed that this bar, he really felt that this bar of soap was something that helped him stay alive longer. Hungary wanted to become allies with Russia because they saw that the war was not going their way. So, because the Germans began to occupy Hungary, Hungary wasn't in control anymore, and at that point, they sent 500,000 Jews to different camps, and my grandfather was in 2 different camps. He was in Mundhausen and Gunskir. So that's how my grandfather lived out the rest of the war in these between these 2 camps. They were like sister camps until they were liberated in 1945. And actually, the American troops that liberated my grandfather from camp was an all African American battalion. So while my grandfather was away, both in the labor service and then eventually having been put into camps, my grandmother and her sister and my father remained in the Jewish ghetto until Hungary was liberated, and then they were able to leave there. Of course, my father was a baby. He was very, very sick, very malnourished. And at that point, my grandmother had gotten word that my grandfather had died in the camps. So she picked up my dad and went into the outskirts, into the countryside of Hungary, and left my father in a convent so that he could be taken care of and nurtured while she went out to try to figure out how she was going to start her life over. And it was there in the countryside that my grandfather found them eventually. He had come back, he bribed a soldier to help um, sneak him from the eastern part of Hungary, which was under Russian rule, to the liberated western side of Hungary, which was under like British and American rule. So he bribed somebody to help him get there. That's when he got back into the city, found people that were able to tell him where my grandmother and my father had gone. And he eventually found them there. So my grandmother's family, her father survived with them. Her sister survived, and her sister's daughter survived. However, her sister's daughter was one of the people that was sent to Auschwitz and was actually a patient of Dr. Mengele and survived it. And this always does make me a bit emotional, is that when Ollie's, my aunt's daughter, was brought back to her mother from with a German soldier, or whoever, not a German soldier, I guess, liberated one of the liberators. He knocked on the door to Ollie's mother's house and was like, "Here's your daughter." And Ollie's, I'm sorry, Bubby was her name, closed the door on them. She was like, "My daughter died in the Holocaust." She was looking at her daughter, but she didn't recognize her. And she thought that it was like some sick joke that was being played on her. And so she shut the door in her own daughter's face because she couldn't recognize her. And the soldier knocked on the door again and said, "No, no, lady, this is your daughter. Like, sorry you don't recognize her." But and Ollie's was like, "Mom, it's me." And she eventually went into the apartment and, was reunited with her mother. Um, but I think that story showcases how changed and how after the abuse and the starvation and all of that, um, I just think it really highlights how awful the situation was if a mother couldn't recognize her own child. So once the war was over, there were a lot of opportunities for Jews in Israel at the time. It was called Palestine, and Canada. But my grandmother only wanted to come to the United States. So luckily, my grandfather had a cousin who was living in America because one of his brothers had married an American. So he had a cousin or a nephew that lived in America who was willing to sponsor my grandparents and my father to bring them to America. The Jewish underground was helping the Jews get out of Europe, and my grandparents went to a displaced persons camp for 2 years in Austria, and then they were able to get to Hamburg, Germany, where they waited for about a year to receive their papers to come to America, and then they got on a ship, and, it took another several months for them to get across the world, basically, and they came through New York, not through Ellis Island, it was already closed at that time, so they came to some different port, and, then from there, they got on a train and came across the country to Los Angeles, where, my father basically grew up from the time that he arrived. My father shares a memory of arriving in Los Angeles on Christmas Day, 1948, and it was snowing in Los Angeles. So that was weird. I don't know how that happened, but that was at that time. Both my grandparents died before I was old enough to actually have these conversations with them. And my father said growing up with them that they didn't talk about the war very much. Um, I know that, I mean, when I asked my father why he thinks his parents were lucky enough to survive, my father's answer is very clear. He says it's luck. So I don't, unfortunately, I never got to really know if it was determination on my parents' side. I mean, I think it had to be on my grandparents' side rather. I mean, I think it had to be in the sense that there were so many stories of my grandfather being so close to death. There's a story of they rounded up all the Jews from the ghetto and took my grandmother holding my father into the Danube, down by the Danube River, where they were going to shoot everybody. And somehow, miraculously, my grandfather found out about this and was able to again bribe a soldier to get down to where my grandmother and father were, and from the side of this like murder fest, it was like, Magda, come on. And the soldier that he had bribed helped save them, and they went, back to the ghetto and continued surviving through this crazy experience. Nobody really talked about the details of it. My grandfather wrote a manuscript that I've read a couple of times in my life. I probably could use another read through. The thing I find most fascinating about his documentation of his story is that as he as he goes through the chronology of his experience, his English gets worse. So when he starts, as I'm writing this story for my children to know my story, it's pretty clear and coherent. But as he gets deeper into the trauma that he experienced, he loses his ability to actually articulate in the language in which he started the manuscript in. I grew up my whole life knowing that my father was a Holocaust survivor. And I also grew up sort of always saying like, "Oh yeah, my father's whole family was killed in the Holocaust," aside from like four or five members. And it was sort of like just routine, something that I said because I had heard it so many times. And it wasn't until I was a young adult, like late teens, that my father went to Hungary for a visit, and he saw one of the, children of one of the survivors, and they actually built a family tree, and he brought it home and shared it with us, and I understood the breadth of what that meant, that his entire family was killed in the Holocaust. Um, so I grew up with it because my father was my father, and he himself was a survivor. Um, but I don't think I really understood what it meant until I was, you know, in my late teens when this family tree came back from Hungary with my father. I think, like most Jews that understand what our heritage is, once we start to learn about it, we're like, it's unbelievable that something like that could happen. That my own relatives lived through something like that. So it's pretty intense and heartbreaking to learn that that was our history. But I also, from a very young age, had a lot of pride in my Judaism and in the fact that both my grandparents and father did survive, and have always taken the responsibility of telling their story and sharing the important responsibility of being Jewish and making sure that my kids understood the importance of being Jewish and knowing that, we're passing this flame on, and that it is our responsibility to do so. Today, in honor of my father, who thank God is still alive, and my grandparents who are now gone, um, my husband and I have decided to raise our family, with a very um, dedicated fire to Judaism. We have keep a kosher home, and we've raised our children in a religious home and observing Shabbat home. We've sent our children to Jewish schools so that they can understand that their roots, their Judaism, their heritage is as much a part of them as their eye color. And yeah, it's been a priority for me to educate my children to understand that we were lucky enough to survive, and so many didn't. And with that luck of survival, it's our responsibility to maintain our place in the world and educate and share the amazing light that it is to be Jewish, and never let that be diminished again. The biggest lesson I've learned from what my grandparents went through would be that, I mean, it's the bar that I compare everything to. Well, at least we're not in the Holocaust. At least we didn't have to experience what my grandparents experienced in order to survive and to stay afloat and to stay optimistic and to believe that in the end everything is going to be okay. It's a pretty grounding um vein that runs through my being. I definitely um think that there's a historical trauma that lives inside of my blood because of my father's experience and his parents' experience. Um, Even being conceived in the ghetto, the stress and the reality of their lives, I think, does go into my father's DNA and therefore into my DNA and therefore into my children's DNA. Survival matters. And being able to figure it out, no matter how bad it is in my blood and in my DNA. If I told the story of my family's survival and they responded to me of that, if they responded with they didn't believe me, denying history doesn't make it disappear. It's always painful to analyze how destructive the human the human being can be. It hurts my soul to remember that there is evil in this world. And it's it makes me sad. It makes me sad for the people that had to experience it. It makes me sad for my children that that is true, that that exists in the world, and that the um the people of the world that believe in peace and love like I do have to fight for it. It isn't, even though for someone like me that is the obvious reset is peace and love. Um, we sometimes can't just peacefully pray for that. We actually have to fight for it. And that is always that's always painful for me to look at and talk about. A lesson that I hope my children and my future children's children take from knowing that their lineage is survivors of the Holocaust will be having pride in their Judaism, knowing that it's important for them to be Jewish and carry on the traditions of our heritage and fight for other people that are being discriminated against. It's important to me that they learn the lesson that anyone can be persecuted and that standing by is not enough, that we have to actively fight against hatred and misunderstanding, that people's historical pain and historical trauma matter. And it's not something that we can forget about or sweep under the rug or, um, not take seriously. I think if we forget history or deny history, um, we are destined to repeat the atrocities of the past, whether it's to us again or to another group of people that are misunderstood or put into danger. I think if we learn about our history and we share our history and we teach our history, then we can um, hopefully we can make sure it doesn't happen again to anyone, Jews or anyone else. Retelling our story is a fundamental part of being Jewish. It's what we do on Passover. Um, it's what we do on Hanukkah. It's what we do on Purim. We tell our stories, and our Holocaust story should be no different. We have to keep telling them.
Thank you for listening to If You Heard What I Heard. If you'd like to learn more about our work and support our mission to make sure the world never forgets, please visit our website, ifyouheardwhatiheard.com. We will never let these stories be lost. It is the job of our generation to make sure future generations never forget so that it never happens again.